Go and stand on the mountain, in the quiet. I, the Lord, the All-Powerful, want you to be there when I pass by. Wait and listen for my presence. I'm not in the wind, or the earthquake, or the fire. No, I am a soft whisper in the gentle breeze. I am with you.
Good morning, NorthPoint. Got a question for you this morning. How many of you have ever acted before in a play, a skit, a drama, something like that? Quite a few of you. I wonder if any of you have ever been in a, say like a TV commercial or a TV show or a movie. Do we have any NorthPoint movie stars that are out here today? All right, we got one in the back, we got one up here. We got a few different ones. All right, we had some in first service as well. I want to hear those stories after the service, okay? Here's the thing about acting is if you like the stage and you like performance, there is a big thrill to be able to do that. Now, for some of you, it's the scariest thing in the world, and you're like, I'd rather die, right, than be on a stage. But I imagine even if you don't like acting, and maybe you haven't done it formally, we've all done some level of informal acting, I think. Like maybe even when you were a kid and on Christmas Eve, you had to, play out the Christmas story there for your family, do a little skit with Mary and Joseph and the baby and all those things. For some of you, you maybe ham it up when you get injured. You know what I'm talking about? Like you bump your knee on something and you start screaming and yelling like you just snapped your femur in half. And you gotta get some attention for the pain that you are feeling. Any injury actors out there? Any screamers? Like whenever you do just a little bit of pain, it's like, ah! It's like the worst thing in the world. We have some knives at home. We've got Cutco knives that are super sharp. And so every once in a while you're cutting something and then like, I just hate the slice of a knife across the skin. Even saying that, some of you are like, right? And so when I do that, I immediately like scream, like this, and then I'll hold it. And then Michelle's like, what did you do? I was like, I don't know. And she's like, you're going to have to take your finger off that eventually. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm holding it the rest of the day. And then I take it off, and it's like, there's not even any blood there or something. But you got to get some sympathy, right? And so some of you've acted in that way. Some of you have acted kind of like coy and hard to get with somebody that you like. Others of you have acted pouty before, right? When you're a little bit upset about something. Some of you, maybe sometimes you've tried to act like you're smart, or on the other hand, act like you're dumb, or act like you're funny to get people, to laugh at you, humorous, that kind of way. So there's ways in which we've all acted, and sometimes I think when we come to church in this place on a Sunday morning, we think we have to act, right? We have to do the, hey, how are you doing? I'm doing good. How are you doing? Good, I'm fine. You're fine. Everybody's fine. We're all fine. Yay, right? And then you move on. You do just that thing that we do. And sometimes when you come into church too, you think like, I've got to, my life has to be together. I got to put on church face. And there's lingo that I have to use and things that you got to say and ways that you have to act because your life has to be put together when you come into this place. And there's some measure of that goes on in your workplace, and it goes on in your school, and it might even go on in your family as well. In one sense, we're all acting all of the time. We're all presenting ourselves in a certain way in the context in which we live with the expectations that are set for us in each of those different environments that we live in. We're all acting. The issue is whether or not what we're acting like on the outside is actually what's going on in the inside. Or are we regularly play acting? Are we creating a false persona? Are we looking like something and projecting something to people on the outside that is not really who we are, or it's not really what we believe, but we just act falsely? Now, in some ways, we all do this, and to some degree, we live in a place where we've got to do a little bit of that. I mean, when you're getting to know a new work environment, a new school environment, a new context, you don't immediately trust the people that you're with, right? And so you got to get to know them and get to understand the culture, and some of that makes sense for sure. There's even this thing when we're young about finding ourselves and who we are and trying different things out. Sure, there's some degree of that, but a problem ensues over time when there becomes a great distance regularly between who we are on the inside and what we act like on the outside. When we continually project a false persona all of the time, and so a gulf just ensues between who we really are and what we look like. When we do that and that gulf grows, one of two things might happen. One thing that might happen is when you present this false self, this false persona, and people affirm that false persona, it just establishes that false persona very deeply in you because you're getting pats on the back for it. And you might come to embrace that false persona, and I should live this way because this is what people are affirming in me. And so there becomes an increasing distance between who you are and what you act like. We call these people inauthentic. We call them fake. We say that person is not real. They're kind of a phony because I don't think what they're acting like on the outside is what's really going on the inside. Or maybe you actually start believing that you are the false persona that you have created, right? You begin to become your projected self, not your real self. And for people like that get really deeply into that, you might start losing a grip on reality, on what is actually true. I think this is the thing that habitual liars fall into. If you are a habitual liar, you've been around one, you just started lying naturally, and it produced some decent results for you, and so that you can just continue to lie over and over again. And the thing about habitual liars is they don't typically know that they're lying or think that they are. They think that what they're saying, even though they're falsehoods, and sometimes boldly so, and sometimes everybody else realizes nothing that person says is true. The person doesn't know it because they become their false persona, right? You ever seen somebody like that? I mean, I'm telling you, I'm honest with you. There are some people that I know, I'm like, I love you, but I don't believe anything that comes out of your mouth. I don't take anything you say at false value because I think you've lived in this fantasy world of a false self that you have created. Sometimes this is people, too, that are chameleons. Just depending on who they're with and what circumstance they're in, they act whatever they need to act like there, and I act whatever I need to act like here, and I act like whatever I need to act like here. But none of those things are the true self. And sometimes they get caught when a person from this context sees them in this context, and then they're like, well, that's not how you act over here, and you realize a false self that has been reaffirmed by individuals has created this. So on one hand, affirmation can reaffirm the false self. On the other hand, if when we play act, our false self, our false persona is discouraged by others, it's not affirmed, we may feel a deep loss and rejection in our lives. We might look for other false personas to try on. So let's say, for instance, that you have a lot of self-doubt in the core of your being. You really doubt yourself. You might say, well, I really doubt myself, but I can't let others in on that, so I need to act confident and overconfident, which might lead into arrogance and bold statements and criticizing other people. And if I try that, actually because I have self-doubt and other people discourage that, they don't affirm it, I realize that's not working. And if I want to have any friends or relate to anybody, I can't act like that, so I've got to try something else. And instead of dealing with the self-doubt, you say, well, the confidence, arrogance didn't work. Let me try self-deprecating humor. So I'll make fun of myself, and I'll kind of let people know that I'm just a good, carefree guy or gal, and all of that. But that's just another false persona that you have tried on. And when those are discouraged, you might just keep trying on other false personas that are not really who you truly are. And if you do that repeatedly, and it continues to be discouraged and not affirmed by others, you may find yourself in a very dark place. So that rejection of the false self may destroy you. On one hand, affirmation can reaffirm your false self and create a greater distance between who you are and what you look like on the outside. And on the other hand, a rejection of the false self could destroy you. Which means we need some help with this. How do we be authentically who we are? How do you be authentically who you are and not just play act and not be false? Well, as always, Jesus has some help for us on this. And the help Jesus is going to give to us today comes from his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 6. So if you got a Bible, go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 6, page 787 in the Bibles in the chairs there. We're going to look at just one small section of the Sermon on the Mount in the month of February, where Jesus addresses spiritual practices. Now, to the Jewish audience that Jesus is speaking to and directly addressing, they saw three primary spiritual practices for what they might call Jewish piety. Being religious as a Jewish person, being spiritual. It consists of three primary practices. Almsgiving, that is giving to the poor and the needy, prayer, and fasting. And essentially what Jesus is going to say, the way that you have come to practice and see and understand these things is completely screwed up. You're doing them all, and especially your leaders are doing them completely wrong, and we've got to reshape this. Here's what you care about. You care about presentation and performance, with spiritual practices. But let me tell you what they're really all about. They're about the heart. They're about what is going on inside of you, not on the outside. Now, I do want to teach this from the NIV. That's the main translation of the Bible that we use here. But I want to read it to you first and look at it briefly from the Message translation of the Bible, because I think it'll hit home for us from the Message. The verses will be up on the screen. Let me read it to you. Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, Jesus speaking. He says, "Be especially careful when you're trying to be good so that you don't make a performance out of it. It might be good theater, but the God who made you won't be applauding. When you do something for someone else, don't call attention to yourself. You've seen them in action, I'm sure. Play actors, I call them. Treating prayer meeting and street corner alike as a stage. Acting compassionate as long as someone is watching. Playing to the crowds. They get applause, true, but that's all they get. When you help someone out, don't think about how it looks. Just do it quietly and unobtrusively. That is the way your God, who conceived you in love, working behind the scenes, helps you out. And when you come before God, don't turn that into a theatrical production either. All these people making a regular show out of their prayers, hoping for 15 minutes of fame. Do you think God sits in a box seat? Here's what I want you to do. Find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there, as simply and honestly as you can manage. The focus will shift from you to God, and you will begin to sense His grace. The world is full of so-called prayer warriors who are prayer ignorant. They're full of formulas and programs and advice, peddling techniques for what you want from God. Don't fall for that nonsense. This is your Father you're dealing with, and He knows better than you what you need. With a God like this loving you, you can pray very simply. You can pray like this. Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are. Set the world right. Do what's best, as above, so below. Keep us alive with 3 square meals. Keep us forgiven with you and forgiving others. Keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. You're in charge. You can do anything you want. You are ablaze in beauty. Yes, yes, yes. There is something so freeing and life-giving when we see what Jesus intends for our spiritual practices, how He reshapes this. And what Jesus is doing here is he's trying to let the crowds and the opinions of other people fade into the background. He helps us to see that the affirmation of people or their disapproval, it doesn't matter all that much. He helps us to see that trying to impress other people or impress ourselves or impress God fades to the background of simply just being with God. And if I can be real and honest and open with God, then alignment between my outer life and my inner life, it becomes more consistent. It grows much closer together. Because eventually play acting wears you out. You know that, right? Being a fake person, putting on airs, being different with different crowds, not ever being honest with what you truly feel and how you truly are on the inside, that is absolutely exhausting over time. And sometimes it's hard to keep up with what you said to whom and how you acted in this circumstance and in this situation. I got to say the right thing. I got to do the right thing. How can I get affirmation now? How can I get affirmation now? How can I get the most likes? How can I get attention? What will get a laugh? What will get me friends? What will get me advanced in my career? Right? That's exhausting stuff that we deal with. Now, don't get me wrong. I do love a good performance. I like performance. I like to go to shows. When I was in high school, I was in a couple of dramas. In fact, in one, I was the villain, which is fun. I thought about giving you a picture. I'm not. But I wore all black and a black cape and a black top hat and a black curly mustache and that kind of thing. So I love that. I love sports. I play basketball, and I was the guy. I was like, give me the ball at the end of the game. I want it to live or die with me. I want the ball, right? I love that kind of stage. I talk to you all the time, and for me, I love a great performance, a great concert, a great presentation, a great workshop, any of those kinds of performances. I really like those. You've been a part of those. You probably had to perform like that in some way. And yet there also are nerves in the midst of that, but the thrill of performing. You know something else, though, if you've ever had to perform in any way? There also is great relief when you're done, when you're finished and you walk off the stage, when you leave the crowd, Whether the crowd is cheering for you and excited about what you've done, or they're booing and you're thinking, I think they were falling asleep, I don't think they cared at all about what I said. Either way, when you get to leave that performance, you leave the crowd and there's some relief because the crowd doesn't know you. They don't actually know you at all. The people that you are trying to impress and get affirmation from, they don't know you at the core of who you really are. But your family and your closest friends do, and you need them more than the applause. And they matter to you more than any disapproval you might feel. You need a genuine relationship of love off the stage. And this is why when we continually act, when we're continually false, when that false persona takes center stage for us, when the outside doesn't match the inside, nobody knows you. You haven't put yourself in any relationships where you can receive and understand genuine love or reciprocate genuine love because you're not really known. You're always on the stage with people who do not know you or love you because the real you isn't there. For example, you might think that you really know and you love, well, just take your favorite performer. If you could go to any concert, any performance, any comedian, any sporting event, your favorite athlete, whatever. You just pick it right now in your mind. Who would that person be that you could go to see? Okay? So imagine that you're going to see that person. I'm guessing if we polled Americans, one of the top people on that list would be Taylor Swift, probably, right? Did you get tickets? Did you get the Ticketmaster tickets? I don't know if you did or not, right? But if you didn't, and then you decide, I'm just going to drop $3,000. I'm just going to drop $3,000 for a ticket to go see Taylor Swift, hottest show in town, right? And you go and you're like, I love Taylor Swift. I love it. She's such a good performer. I love her music. It is so great. But I want you to think about Taylor Swift for a minute. What does Taylor Swift get from you? Other than your money and your applause, she gets nothing from you. She gets nothing that she really, really needs from you. And in fact, you don't actually love Taylor Swift. You love what Taylor Swift does for you. You love the music that she produces. You love how it makes you feel when you see her perform so well. That's what you love about Taylor Swift. You don't love her. And if Taylor Swift only lives off of the applause and the praise from people that come to her concerts, she's going to live a very difficult life, at least in her inner life, right? Because she needs to step off the stage and have some relationships of love in her life. For all of us that play act, that are always on the stage, that are always performing for others, we may receive affirmation from them when what we really need is love and a genuine relationship. At the bottom of it all, there is only one who can provide that for you. I think this is what Jesus is getting at. He's saying when we pray and we fast and we do spiritual practices, even when you come to a service, like this, you do church, and we do that simply for performance, we do it for others and their approval, or even we simply do it for ourselves to feel good about our spirituality, we may get what we wanted out of it. You might get a feeling of spirituality, or you might get the applause and the approval of other people. You might get the affirmation of being a good performer, but that's all you get. God's not in it. And it actually has very little to do with him. And it's not even about the real you. Jesus is saying that whole thing is screwy. Instead, when we see spiritual practices as a way to connect with God, to hear from him, to talk with him, we begin to see who we truly are. We begin to sense this relationship where there is love, where there is affirmation from the one who created us. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at. Look at it again in Matthew chapter 6, in verse 6 in the Message. He says this, here's what I want you to do. Find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Which is like, why would we role play before God anyways? It's not like God's like, oh, yeah, I thought that's who you really were. No, he knows. You can't trick him. He sees us. He sees in the depths of our being. So get a quiet place away from everybody else where you don't have to act before God and just be there as simply and as honestly as you can manage. I love how this is said because it's like you're a human being, so it's not always easy and it's not always simple. But try to get there with him and just be there as simply, as honestly as you can manage. And in that moment, the focus will begin to shift from you. And I would say from others. It'll begin to shift to God. And you will begin to sense his grace, his love, and his affirmation. The very thing that you need. that brings both healing and consistency to our inner and outer life. Not praying or fasting or attending church or doing our spiritual practices so we can increase our standing or so we can impress others, but praying and fasting and even being here so we can be reminded that God loves us and that He's already given us our standing. And as we live in that space, praying genuinely to God, you find out who you really are. You find out what your worth is, what your value is, what your identity is. You find freedom and life in Him. And you can then begin to be who He has made you to be, inside and outside, without having to prove yourself, without having to perform, without having to play act, because the God of the universe sees you and loves you. Jesus' invitation here is an invitation for you to see who God truly is and to see who you are. Prayer is the tool that helps us reorient our lives every single day to who God is and to who we are so that we can live authentic lives. Let me put this together for us with three specific truths that Jesus gives us from verse 6 of Matthew chapter 6. And this is where we're going to switch over to the NIV. So your pastor's super spiritual today. I brought up 2 Bibles, all right? So we're going to go to Bible number 2, the NIV. And I want you to notice this, how it says it in the NIV, first from verse 5. Here's what Jesus says. He says, "And when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. Don't be like the play actors. Don't put on false airs. Don't be something you're not. They love to pray standing in the synagogue and on the street corners so that others will see them. I tell you, they've received their reward in full." That's what they wanted. They wanted attention. They'll probably get attention. But that's all that they get. Instead, verse 6, "When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." 3 truths that Jesus gives us here about prayer from verse 6. First, Jesus says prayer is important because we need God. Prayer is important because we need God. You notice that Jesus says here, "when you pray," which is very interesting because He just got done saying, you're doing it all wrong, you're thinking about these spiritual practices completely the wrong way, and so He doesn't say, so we're just going to get rid of it. We're not going to do prayer anymore because you guys have totally screwed it up, let's do something else. It's kind of like at my house, I've told you before, we like to play board games and card games, right? And so since Christmas, we've had a couple of games that we've been playing repeatedly over and over again. And normally it goes pretty well. But there are a lot of voices in my house, and there is a great competitive spirit. So Michelle and I have said, we have all daughters, we're going to try to raise strong, independent women. Hopefully dependent upon God, but independent and strong women. And sometimes, like, say for instance, when you're playing games, that can come back to bite you a little bit. Because there is, again, a great competitive spirit that is there. Michelle and I are both fairly competitive, and then you get all the girls together, and then you get a dad who's like, I'm not giving you an easy win. I don't care if you're 2 years old. Like, you got to learn to strategize and to think and to work hard, right? You got to earn your wins. I'm not patronizing you by just being easy on you. Like, let's do. So this is the environment we have right, in our house when we play games. Dad never lets us win, right? Now they're getting old enough where they can actually beat Dad, so that's kind of interesting. Anyways, okay, so that's our environment, right? So sometimes as we're playing games, it goes really well, and other times, oh my goodness, the bickering and the fighting and the yelling and the back and forth, and it just gets to such a level that I'm just like, all right, we're done. The game is over. Nobody wins. We're finished up. We are not playing this game anymore because you're all screwing it up, and maybe I'm screwing it up and I'm getting angry as well at the same time, right? Jesus doesn't do that here. He doesn't say to them, because you're completely screwing up prayer, just forget about it. No, He says, I want to redeem it. I want to show you what it's really all about. You do need to pray because you need God. And Jesus went on in His life that even though He is the Son of God, even though this is God as a human being, Luke tells us that He often withdrew to quiet places to pray. And Jesus didn't just pray as a model to us to tell us what we should do. He prayed because He was fully human and He needed the Father. He needed the Father's voice. He needed the Father's direction. He needed those moments with God so that there is consistency in Him living out the plan of God in the Father's power, right? And so Jesus tells us here, don't get rid of prayer. Prayer is important because you need God. We need to pray because we need God. So it's not just like, Okay, I got to pray. Okay, I go to NorthPoint. We're doing a month on prayer. Okay, so I got to sit here for like 4 weeks and hear about how bad of a prayer I am, and got to get better at prayer. They're going to give me a prayer guide. That puts the pressure on. Now I really got to do it because I got resources for it. So they're going to talk about it. They're going to have a week of prayer. I got to do a half an hour time slot. Okay, yeah, I should get better at prayer. What Christian is like, I kill it with prayer. I am actually really good with prayer. Not many. Most of us are like, I got to do better. And sometimes we can feel the guilt and the pressure, and I got to do this, I better do this, I have to do this. Instead, I think what Jesus wants is he wants it to be more like, wait a minute, God is willing to listen to me? The God who created all of this, the whole universe, and me, he wants me to come to him. He actually wants me to talk to him. Nobody else listens to me. People tell me to shut up, right? They tell me my stories go on too long. I keep saying to make a long story short, and I never make the story shorter. It just keeps getting longer, right? But like, God wants to actually listen to me, and he wants to help me, and he wants to speak to me. Well, he created all this, right? And he created every single one of you. It's pretty cool that he wants to talk to you. So how should we do this then? If prayer is important and we need God and he wants us to come before him, how do we do it? Jesus goes on, verse 6. When you pray then, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Secondly, prayer, Jesus says, it's not about performance. It's about relationship. It's about you and God talking and listening. That's Jesus' point. There's a contrast you notice that Jesus is making between those who pray publicly. They pray in the synagogues and they pray on the street corners so that others will see them. That's public and it's outward. It's, we might say, horizontal. It takes all the information around them. You're thinking about people. You're thinking about what you sound like. You're thinking about how you appear. You're thinking about how you feel, about how well your performance is, versus going into your house, shutting the door, and praying to your Father who is what, does he say? Unseen. Who is unseen. It's vertical. Public versus what is unseen. In the past, we talked about the prayer closet. You know, go to your prayer closet, which just means like just you be there with God. And the Message translation, he says, so that you can begin to shift your eyes from here to here, and you'll begin to sense his grace. Now, when Jesus says, go into your room and shut the door and basically don't let anybody else know what you're doing, he doesn't mean that praying publicly is wrong. Otherwise, we're sinning every Sunday when we pray here in our services. We have that in the rest of the New Testament. Paul does that. The early church does that for sure. Jesus' point is don't pray for show. Don't just pray for other people. It's about you talking to and hearing from God, which then means that formulas and just raw repetition and saying the same prayer over and over and over again, like thinking in your mind, if I pray this 10 times, God's got to answer it because I did it enough. I performed it well enough. I showed my commitment to really praying seriously by praying the same words over and over again. Jesus says, forget that. Look at verse 7. Look at what he says. When you pray, don't keep on babbling like the pagans. Repetition in prayer without thinking about what you're saying is babbling. God doesn't hear it. They think that they'll be heard because of their many words. They go on and on. Don't be like them. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him about it. It's not like, God, did you hear me? And if I say this 7 more times, will you really hear me? I'll show you my great devotion to you by doing this. Jesus said, no, that's not what it's about. You can't impress God. You can't impress God, so don't try to impress God. He already knows what you need. You're not going to get something from him or manipulate him by just doing it a bunch of times, but have a sincerity to it and a simplicity to it. I think if Jesus was here today, he said, hey, he might say to us, you don't need a prayer voice. Do you know what I'm talking about? Some of you have this. I love you, okay? But here it comes. Like some of you have the prayer voice. And pastors sometimes are very guilty of having the prayer voice. And maybe you know of some people that have the prayer voice. So I'm talking to you in a regular conversation, and this is what I talk like, hey, how you doing? How was your week? Yeah, we're doing pretty good. How are you doing? Yeah, we got this going on. And then when it's time for us to pray in our group, it's like, our Father, which art in heaven, thank thee that you are with us today. And you just become British or something. I don't know, because it sounds more spiritual and smart. You just talk different. It's a different tone. It's a different intonation. And I think Jesus would say, just talk to me from your heart and just be with me. You don't need a separate prayer voice that's ultra spiritual. You can't impress God. When Jesus says this to us, that means there's some freedom to just be genuine with him. And even if you're like, okay, yeah, I should pray. The God of the universe wants to hear me, but I don't know how to pray. I would just say to you, if you're new to this whole thing and you don't really know how to pray, do you know how to talk or think thoughts in your head? If you can talk or you can think thoughts in your head, then you can pray. You can just start with that. You don't have to try to impress God. You just need to speak to him. And we'll see some things next week about how. There's some direction in Scripture about how to get going on this, but it's as simple as talking to him. And then as you do, Jesus goes on and says this, your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Here's the third and final thing that Jesus says about prayer. He says, prayer rewards us. Prayer does reward us. And again, Jesus contrasts those who pray publicly for attention. They might get what they're looking for out of it. But those of you that pray in secret, in a relationship with God, really seeing him and looking to him, you also receive a reward. There is a reward for praying. So the question is, what's the reward? What do you think the reward is? Jesus doesn't exactly tell us what the reward is here, but he probably intends that it means some answers to prayer, right? That he actually listens to you, he hears you, he gives you wisdom, guidance, direction that you need. He gives you strength, he gives you encouragement, maybe sometimes big answers to prayer. Maybe he brings healing sometimes, but he certainly hears what you're asking and you're connecting with him, so you are growing spiritually. He will reward you in that way. But I think the key reward is found in something that Jesus does here that is not surprising to us at all, and I know it wasn't surprising to you because when I read it in the text, nobody was like, oh, I can't believe that is true. But to Jesus' first century Jewish listeners, they would have absolutely been shocked by what Jesus said. And you know what it was? It was that Jesus called God the Father. The Father. No less than 10 times in verses 1 through 18 does Jesus call God the Father. Not surprising to us, revolutionary to the Jews. See, the Jewish people, they did believe that God was their father, kind of. They were the children of Israel, after all, right? God's chosen people. But do you know that the term father was rarely ever used of God in all the Old Testament scriptures? The Jewish people didn't think of God as their father. That was not really the relationship that they considered with him. And they certainly wouldn't be praying to God as their father. That was too impersonal. That was too close. That was too familiar for them to do that. They thought of God as sovereign ruler, king of the universe, holy one, just one, all of those things. And so Jesus' words here that when you pray to God, you're praying to your Father was jarring to them. In fact, it's likely that Jesus wasn't even intending to really use the formal word for father, like our word for father in this context, but he was beginning to introduce to us another word, another way that he wanted us to see God. See, later on in another gospel, Jesus will pray to the Father, and he will pray this way. He prays, Abba, Father. So a little language lesson real quick. In the Greek language that the New Testament was written in, the word is pater, for father. Paternal, we get our word, from that. Paternal, pater, father. The word Abba is an Aramaic term. And the Jews of Jesus' day, that was the common language they actually used. Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic. This is an untranslated word in the New Testament scriptures. We've kept it because of what it means. And so Jesus prays to Abba, pater, Abba, Father. You know what the word Abba means? Many of you know this. It's much more equivalent to our word daddy or papa. Does that make you a little uncomfortable? It kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. That when Jesus prays, he says, you should pray to your dad. You should pray to your papa. And if it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, you can imagine how uncomfortable the Jewish people would feel that they could address God as their dad. I'm not sure they heard anything else that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount after he said, you should pray to your daddy, right? You should pray to your father. I'm kind of serious about that. I think they had to be thinking, I hope somebody writes this down and they put this in like a gospel account or something so we can go back and actually think about what Jesus said, because I am just off on this rabbit trail of how in the world would Jesus be so irreverential to tell us that we would address the sovereign ruler of the universe as our dad. It doesn't work that way. I have a couple of great-grandmothers. I had a couple of great-grandmothers when I was really young that were still living. I'm from West Virginia, and so when I was really young, we lived there. And my great-grandmothers had some special names. And I'm going to tell you what they were, and you're going to be like, okay. It wasn't grandma. It wasn't even Nana. We didn't even have a Mimi in our family. My great-grandmother's nicknames that we called them were Kakai and Gang. That's what they were. I don't exactly know where those came from, but that was their name. My great-grandmother, whose name is Kakai, her first name is actually Winona. I don't even know what the first name of Gang is. I thought I should call my mom this weekend and ask her, what was great-grandmother's Gang's first name? I don't know. Now, when I share those names with you, does that make you feel a little bit like, that's a little bit weird, Jeremy? We also, in our family, we have an Uncle Bun. My dad's brother, when he was really little, I think one of his siblings called him Bunny, and it stuck for the rest of his life. He's like 60-some years old now, and we still call him Uncle Bun, after Uncle Bunny. At least we shortened it to Bun. I don't know, honey buns. I don't know what that is, but... Now, here's the thing. If you met any of those members of my family, you would not say, hey, Kakai. Hey, Gang. You'll be like, what's her name? What's her name? Mrs. Stevens, maybe? I should call her that instead. I'm not going to call her that. You know why you don't call her that? Because you're not in my family. It's a family name. And so when Jesus comes to us and he says, I got a family name for you to address God, it's Dad. He is your Father. Creator of the universe? Yes. Sovereign and Holy One? Yes. Righteous Judge and King? Absolutely. But the relationship that overshadows all of those, Father and Son, Father and daughter. So the one being with all power and all wisdom and all control looks down upon you and says, come talk to your dad. I've got you. I want to hear from you. And I have some things to say to you. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1 says it this way, see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. And that is who we are. Do you see how this gets us back to where we started this message? Jesus is saying to us today, stop trying to perform. Stop play acting. Stop being false. Stop trying to be something that you are not. You don't have to perform. You don't have to be false. You don't have to impress by your actions or your performance or your job or your achievements or your fit body or your humor. You are a child of God. You are loved by God. You see the invitation from Jesus? What he's saying to you is, come pray so that you can sit in the presence of God your Father and come to remember who you are by remembering who he is. That when you get alone with him and you start your day with him and you sit down with him, yeah, there probably are things to read for sure in his word to hear from him. And there are maybe people that you should pray for, and there's other things that you can request of him, and you got a lot of things on your mind. But the thing that you need to do is to sit down with him quietly and look up to him and say, Father, remind me who I am. Remind me how you see me. Remind me of my identity. And in those moments, God can speak to you and say, you're my child. You are chosen. You are adopted. You are forgiven. You are redeemed. You are reconciled. You're in the family. Heaven is waiting for you. And I am with you every step of the way. And in that relationship, you find everything you need for this life. Look, this is what Jesus teaches us here in Matthew chapter 6, but you know one other thing we got to see is that Jesus wasn't just a good teacher. He was more than that. And so what Jesus announced to the Jewish people and to us here in Matthew chapter 6, that the God of the universe is actually our Father, well, Jesus had to make that possible for us, right? He had to make us children of God through his death on the cross. I want you to consider Jesus to finish this up. When you consider everything that Jesus went through in his life, Jesus lived this life. Yes, he was God, but he's also fully human. And as a full human being living life on this earth, almost nobody understood him. There's maybe one woman in the gospel accounts that I get the idea that Mary, the Mary of Bethany, maybe was the one that understood him the best. And yet, even his own followers misunderstood him to the point they said, we're leaving you. They abandoned him. One betrayed him. The other one, the strongest one of them all, right? Probably has some self-doubt going on inside of him, Peter, right? So he's projecting this confidence, and he denied Jesus. Jesus was physically tortured. He was mentally abused. His own family, Jesus on one occasion, one of his brothers said, "Why don't you go to Jerusalem and reveal yourself to them there?" Indicating, I hope they would arrest you and kill you because we're tired of you. That's his brother. Great, loving family, right? This is what Jesus endures. How did he do it? Imagine that's your life. That's what God asks you to go through in your life, and then eventually go to a cross so that you can forgive the people that just put you on the cross. How did Jesus do this? You know how he did it? Matthew chapter 3. If you've got a Bible, you can flip back one page so you can see this. At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, before he started it, he was baptized by his cousin John the Baptist. And in Matthew 3 and verse 16, we read this. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven spoke and said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Do you know how Jesus took the cross? You know how he endured all the shame and all the pain, the suffering, the betrayal, the denial, the being completely misunderstood and criticized? Because he knew he had the love of the Father. He knew that his Father was pleased with him. He knew that he was doing the Father's will, that he was accomplishing what God the Father had sent him here to do, and that God the Father was happy with him, and that God the Father loved him. That's what sustained him. And not only did Jesus do all of that so that he could die on the cross and fulfill the Father's will, but this was the way that Jesus made it possible so that you and I could come before God in prayer, in trust and faith in Jesus Christ, and God the Father would say the very same words to you. You are my son. You are my daughter. I am pleased with you, and I love you because of my son, Jesus Christ. After Jesus' death and then resurrection on the cross, on that day, he met a woman named Mary Magdalene. And if you remember this story, standing outside of the tomb, Mary Magdalene is there. She doesn't know that Jesus is resurrected. Jesus reveals himself to Mary. And apparently Mary is trying to hold on to him, like, "Jesus, you left us once and you died, and I'm not letting you go again." And so Jesus responds to her in John 20, and he says this. He says, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." Get this. "Go instead to my," what's the next word? "My brothers." Not my servants, not my disciples, not my apostles. They are now my brothers. And tell them this: I'm ascending to my Father. He is your Father. I'm ascending to my God. He is your God. Do you see what Jesus is doing here? This is the greatest privilege and the highest honor and the most important thing about you. Through Jesus, we are adopted into the family of God. Jesus is your brother. God is your Father. How will you handle everything the world throws at you? How will you handle what you have to accomplish in this life? How will you work through the trials and the struggles and the difficulties that you face? How will you bring a consistency between your inner life and your outer life so that you are not a false person? How do you do that? The love of the Father. The love of the Father. And here in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is saying, prayer is where you remember that. Prayer is where you're reminded of that. Prayer is where you live out of that, where the Father can daily speak to you and say, "You are mine, and I have you." Prayer is where you see who you are, by seeing who the Father is. So church, let's pray. Let's pray, not because we have to, not because we better, not to impress anybody else. But you know why you need to pray? Because God wants you to see who you are. And he wants you to live out of who you are, a beloved, adopted, chosen child of God. Would you pray with me?